The confession hung in the mountain air like morning mist, delicate and devastating. Amy Garcia stood before the towering figure of Aaron Allen, her hands trembling, not from the October cold, but from the weight of words she had never spoken aloud. The mountain man's weathered face remained impassive as stone, his dark eyes studying her with the same careful attention he gave to tracking wounded deer through dense timber. "I can't have children, sir," she had whispered, the admission tearing from her throat like a prayer offered too late. The silence that followed stretched between them like the vast wilderness that surrounded his isolated cabin, filled with the rustle of dying leaves and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Aaron's response had been swift and certain, delivered in the low rumble of his voice that seemed to emerge from the very mountains themselves. "Then I'll borrow some from town." Now, as Amy watched his broad shoulders disappear into the cabin to gather supplies, she wondered how her life had led to this moment, how she had come to stand on the porch of a stranger's home, confessing her deepest shame to a man she barely knew, yet somehow trusted with truths she had never shared with another soul. The journey to this mountain had begun 3 months earlier, in the suffocating parlor of her late husband's sister in Denver. Carol Rogers had made her position clear from the moment Amy's mourning period had officially ended. A barren widow was a burden no respectable family should bear indefinitely, especially one with no inheritance to speak of and hands too soft for honest labor. "You understand, Amy dear," Carol had said, her voice dripping with false sympathy as she poured tea from her finest china set, "that we simply cannot continue this arrangement. With winter approaching and my own children to consider, we must be practical about these matters." Practical. The word had followed Amy like a shadow as she packed her few belongings into a worn carpet bag, as she counted the meager coins that represented her entire worldly wealth, as she stood at the train station with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Practical meant that a woman of 26 with no children and no prospects was worth less than the cost of her keep. The advertisement in the Denver Post had seemed like divine intervention. Housekeeper wanted for remote mountain property. Room and board provided. Serious inquiries only. Contact A. Allen, Pine Ridge Station. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Amy had responded immediately, her letter brief and honest about her qualifications. She could cook, clean, and manage a household, though she had never worked for wages. She was widowed, respectable, and in need of employment. She had not mentioned her inability to bear children. That particular failing seemed irrelevant for a position as a housekeeper. The response had come within a week, along with money for train fare to Pine Ridge Station and instructions to wait at the general store. Amy had made the journey with a mixture of hope and trepidation, watching the landscape change from rolling plains to foothills to the towering peaks of the Rocky Mountains. Each mile had taken her further from everything familiar and closer to an uncertain future. Pine Ridge Station had proven to be little more than a collection of weathered buildings clustered around the railroad tracks, a place where the trains stopped long enough to take on water and discharge the occasional passenger. The general store served as post office, supply depot, and unofficial town center, its shelves stocked with the necessities required for mountain living. George Harris, the store owner, had been expecting her. He was a thin man with kind eyes and the careful manner of someone accustomed to dealing with the desperate and displaced. He had looked her over with the practiced assessment of a man who had seen too many hopeful souls arrive on the train, only to leave on the next one heading back to civilization. "You're sure about this, miss?" he had asked as she waited on the store's front porch, her carpet bag at her feet and her hands folded in her lap. "Aaron Allen's place is a hard day's ride up the mountain. Man keeps to himself, doesn't come to town more than once or twice a year. Some folks say he's been up there so long he's gone half wild." Amy had assured him that she was prepared for isolation, though the truth was she had no idea what she was agreeing to. Her marriage to Thomas Garcia had been comfortable but confined to the social circles of Denver's emerging middle class. She had attended ladies' luncheons and church socials, managed servants, and entertained guests, but she had never lived beyond the reach of neighbors in civilization. When Aaron Allen had finally arrived to collect her, Amy's first impression had been of overwhelming sweat and silence. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the afternoon sun and hands that looked capable of splitting logs, or gentling a frightened animal with equal skill. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, his face tanned and lined from years of mountain weather. He wore clothes that were clean but clearly handmade, practical garments designed for function rather than appearance. Their initial exchange had been brief. He had nodded to George Harris, loaded her bag into his wagon without comment, and helped her onto the seat with careful courtesy. The ride to his cabin had taken them through terrain that grew increasingly wild and beautiful, following narrow trails that seemed to exist more in Erin's memory than in any visible path. The cabin itself had surprised her. She had expected something crude and temporary, but Erin's home was solidly built and well-maintained. The logs were chinked tight against winter weather, the roof was sound, and the windows were glazed with real glass rather than oiled paper. Inside, the furnishings were simple but well-crafted, clearly made by someone who understood both wood and the requirements of mountain living. Erin had shown her to a small room off the main living area, a space that was clean and private with a narrow bed, a wooden chest, and a window that looked out over the valley below. He had explained her duties in his quiet, economical way. She would cook, clean, and maintain the household while he worked his trap lines and tended to the practical matters of survival. In return, she would have room, board, and a small wage to be paid when he made his trips to town. The arrangement had worked well through the summer months. Amy had found a rhythm in the mountain routine, rising before dawn to prepare Erin's breakfast, spending her days cleaning and mending and preparing meals, retiring early to the sound of wind in the pines and the distant call of owls. Erin was a quiet presence, respectful of her privacy and appreciative of her efforts, though he rarely spoke beyond what was necessary. She had learned to read the subtle signs of his moods and needs. The way he paused at the door before heading out to check his traps meant he wanted coffee and a thermos to take with him. The careful way he cleaned his rifle meant he had seen signs of bears or mountain lions and was taking precautions. The evenings when he sat longer by the fire, whittling or mending gear, were times when the isolation pressed against him, and he welcomed the simple comfort of another person's presence. As autumn approached and the first snows dusted the highest peaks, Amy had begun to sense a change in Erin's demeanor. He spent more time at the cabin working on repairs and improvements that seemed designed to prepare for a long winter. He had begun to watch her with a different quality of attention, not the careful courtesy of an employer observing a servant, but something deeper and more personal. The change had culminated in an evening, 3 weeks earlier, when Erin had asked her to sit with him by the fire after the dishes were cleared. He had spoken carefully, choosing his words with the same precision he applied to setting traps or reading weather signs. "Winter's coming hard this year," he had said, his eyes fixed on the flames. "Signs all point to it being a long one, maybe lasting well into April. Town's too far to reach regular once the heavy snows start. We'll be on our own up here for months at a time." Amy had nodded, understanding that he was leading to something important, but uncertain what response he expected. "Thing is," Erin had continued, still not looking at her directly, "arrangement we have now isn't going to work through a hard winter. Too much chance for talk, for misunderstanding. Mountain life doesn't leave room for the kind of proprieties that matter in town." The implication had been clear, though Erin had been too much of a gentleman to state it directly. A man and woman living alone together through a long winter, regardless of the practical nature of their arrangement, would be subject to gossip and speculation. In a small community like Pine Ridge Station, such talk could ruin both their reputations and make it impossible for Amy to find other employment when spring came. Erin's solution had been as practical as everything else about him. Marriage would solve the problem of propriety while allowing their arrangement to continue. It would give Amy security in a permanent home while providing him with the companionship and domestic comfort that made mountain life bearable. It was a business proposition, he had assured her, based on mutual benefit rather than romantic sentiment. Amy had asked for time to consider his offer, though she knew her options were limited. Return to Denver meant facing the same problems that had driven her to the mountains in the first place. She had no family to take her in, no skills that would earn her a living wage, and no prospects for marriage that would provide security. Erin Allen was offering her a home, protection, and a place in the world, asking nothing in return but the continuation of duties she was already performing. The decision should have been simple, but Amy carried a secret that complicated everything. Her first marriage had lasted 8 years without producing children, despite her desperate desire for a family. Doctor after doctor had confirmed what her heart already knew. She was barren, incapable of giving a husband the sons and daughters that made a marriage worthwhile. Thomas had been kind about her failing, but she had seen the disappointment in his eyes, the way he had gradually stopped speaking of the future in terms of children and grandchildren. For weeks, Amy had wrestled with the moral implications of accepting Aaron's proposal without revealing her condition. A marriage of convenience might not require the passionate love of romantic novels, but surely it deserved honesty about such fundamental matters. Yet every time she had tried to find the words to tell him, fear had silenced her. Fear that he would withdraw his offer, that she would be forced to leave the only place that had ever felt like home, that she would face another winter of uncertainty and dependence on the charity of others. The decision had been made for her by the arrival of unexpected visitors. Eric Lopez and Brian Evans had appeared at the cabin 3 days earlier, claiming to be surveyors working for the railroad company. They had been polite but insistent, asking detailed questions about Aaron's land and the surrounding territory. Their interest had seemed to focus particularly on the valley below the cabin, where a clear stream ran year-round and the terrain was relatively level. Aaron had been courteous but wary, answering their questions with the minimum information required by politeness. After they had left, promising to return with more detailed maps and legal documents, he had explained to Amy that railroad companies often use such surveys as the first step in claiming land through eminent domain. If they could prove that his property was essential for their proposed route, they could force him to sell at whatever price they deemed fair. Been expecting something like this for years, Aaron had said, his voice carrying a weariness that spoke of previous battles fought and lost. Railroads been pushing west, looking for the easiest routes through the mountains. My valley would save them miles of difficult construction and give them access to timber and mineral rights they've been wanting. The threat of losing his home had crystallized Aaron's feelings about their arrangement. That evening, he had formally proposed marriage, not as a business arrangement, but as a partnership between two people who had found something worth protecting together. His words had been simple and direct, delivered with the same quiet certainty he brought to all his decisions. I'd be honored to have you as my wife, Amy, not just for the winter, not just for convenience, but permanent-like. This place needs a woman's touch, and I need someone who understands what it means to fight for something worth keeping. Amy had accepted, her heart full of emotions she couldn't name, but the joy had been tempered by the knowledge that she was entering the marriage under false pretenses. The weight of her secret had grown heavier with each passing day, until this morning when she could no longer bear the burden of deception. Standing in the kitchen where she had prepared countless meals, surrounded by the domestic comfort she had helped create, Amy had finally found the courage to speak the truth. The words had come in a rush, tumbling over each other in her haste to confess before her courage failed. Aaron, there's something you need to know before we marry. Something I should have told you from the beginning. Her voice had been barely above a whisper, but in the quiet of the mountain morning, every word had carried clearly. I can't have children, sir. I've been married before for 8 years, and never once refoué. The doctors say there's something wrong with me, that I'll never be able to give a husband the family he deserves. Aaron had listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts or feelings. When she had finished, the silence had stretched between them until Amy had been certain he would ask her to leave, that the revelation of her barrenness had destroyed whatever chance they might have had for happiness together. Instead, his response had been swift and sure, delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to discuss the weather or the condition of his trap lines. Then I'll borrow some from town. Now, as Amy stood on the porch watching Aaron emerge from the cabin with his rifle and a pack loaded with supplies, she wondered what he had meant by those cryptic words. The sound of approaching horses echoed up from the valley below, and she recognized the voices of Eric Lopez and Brian Evans calling out greetings as they rode into the clearing. Aaron's jaw tightened as he stepped beside her, his hand resting casually on the rifle stock. "They're early," he said quietly. "Weren't supposed to be back until next week." The two men dismounted near the porch, their smiles friendly but their eyes cold and calculating. Eric Lopez, the taller of the two, tipped his hat to Amy with exaggerated courtesy before turning his attention to Aaron. Hope you've had time to consider our offer, Alan. Railroad's prepared to be generous, but they need an answer soon. Construction schedule doesn't wait for anyone. Aaron's response was measured but firm. Told you before, this land's not for sale. Been in my family for 3 generations, and I intend to keep it that way. Brian Evans stepped forward, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. Thing is, Alan, Railroad doesn't really need your permission. Eminent domain gives them the right to take what they need for the public good. We're here as a courtesy, offering you a chance to sell voluntary-like before the lawyers get involved. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, acrid and dangerous. Amy felt Aaron tense beside her, his grip tightening on the rifle as he assessed the 2 men before him. The morning that had begun with confession and acceptance was rapidly transforming into something far more dangerous, and Amy realized that the battle for their future was about to begin in earnest. The tension in the mountain air grew thick as molasses as Brian Evans let his hand rest meaningfully on his gun. Amy felt her breath catch in her throat, watching Aaron's weathered face remain impassive as granite while his knuckles whitened on the rifle stock. The morning sun cast long shadows across the clearing, and somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed its harsh warning into the silence. "Gentlemen," Aaron said finally, his voice carrying the same calm authority he used when gentling a spooked horse. "I believe I made my position clear during your last visit. This land stays in my family." Eric Lopez stepped closer to the porch, his polished boots crunching on the fallen leaves. Unlike his partner, he wore no visible weapon, but Amy noticed the calculated way he positioned himself to block any retreat toward the cabin. His smile never wavered, but his eyes held the cold patience of a predator sizing up wounded prey. "Now, Aaron, let's be reasonable here," Lopez said, pulling a folded document from his coat pocket. "The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad has surveyed this entire valley. Your little homestead sits right in the path of progress. We're talking about connecting the eastern markets to the mineral wealth of Colorado. This is bigger than one man's attachment to a few acres of trees and rocks." Amy watched Aaron's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. She had learned to read the subtle signs of his emotions over the months of their arrangement, the way his shoulders set when he was preparing for trouble, the careful stillness that preceded decisive action. But she also noticed something else in his posture now, a protective stance that seemed to include her in whatever stand he was preparing to make. "Progress," Aaron repeated, the word carrying a weight of bitter experience. Same word they used when they moved the Cherokee off their land in Georgia. Same word they used when they slaughtered the buffalo herds and called it civilization. Funny how progress always seems to require taking what belongs to someone else. Brian Evans shifted restlessly, his hand never moving far from his weapon. "You're not Cherokee, Alan, and this isn't Georgia. This is business, pure and simple. Railroad needs this route, and they're going to get it one way or another. Question is whether you walk away with something in your pocket or get dragged off with nothing but the clothes on your back." Amy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning. She had heard similar conversations in Denver, whispered stories of homesteaders who had refused to sell to the railroad companies, only to find their wells poisoned, their livestock scattered, their buildings mysteriously catching fire in the night. The law, such as it was in the territories that tended to side with those who brought jobs and tax revenue, not with stubborn individuals who stood in the way of economic development. "And if I refuse?" Aaron asked her, though Amy suspected he already knew the answer. Lopez unfolded the document with theatrical precision, holding it where Aaron could see the official seals and legal language. "Then the territorial court will declare this land essential to the public good and authorize its seizure under eminent domain. You'll get fair compensation, of course. But fair is whatever the court-appointed assessor determines it's worth. Could be $50, could be $500. Depends on how cooperative you've been during the process." The threat hung between them like smoke from a grass fire, acrid and spreading. Amy found herself thinking of the careful way Aaron had built his life in this isolated valley. The years of labor that had gone into clearing fields and building fences, the deep knowledge of weather patterns and game trails that could only come from intimate familiarity with the land. To lose it all to a legal document signed by men who had never set foot on the property seemed like a particular kind of cruelty. There's another consideration, Evans added, his eyes sliding toward Amy with uncomfortable intensity. Woman like that shouldn't be living way up here in the wilderness. Not safe, not proper. Town would be better for her. More civilized, more opportunities for a respectable widow to find suitable companionship. The words hit Amy like a physical blow, carrying undertones that made her skin crawl. She recognized the threat for what it was, not just against Aaron's land, but against their arrangement, their planned marriage, their fragile hope for a future together. In the rigid social hierarchy of frontier communities, a woman's reputation was as fragile as spun glass and twice as easily shattered. Aaron's response was swift and deadly quiet. Miss Garcia is under my protection. Any man who troubles her will answer to me personally. The formal declaration sent a thrill through Amy's chest, part fear and part fierce pride. In all her years of marriage to Thomas, she had never felt so thoroughly defended, so completely claimed as worthy of protection. But she also understood that Aaron had just escalated the confrontation beyond mere property disputes into something far more personal and dangerous. Lopez and Evans exchanged a look that spoke volumes about their intentions and methods. These were not men accustomed to being defied, especially not by isolated homesteaders with no legal connections or political influence. The railroad companies that employed them had deep pockets and flexible consciences, willing to use whatever methods proved necessary to secure the routes they needed. That's a mighty bold statement from a man living alone on a mountain, Evans said, his voice carrying a new edge of menace. Accidents happen up here all the time. Rock slides, forest fires, bears looking for food before winter sets in. Dangerous country for folks who don't have neighbors to look out for them. Amy felt the blood drain from her face as the implications sank in. These men were not simply threatening legal action or economic pressure. They were talking about violence, about making Aaron and her disappear in ways that would look like natural disasters or animal attacks. The isolation that had been their refuge was suddenly revealed as their greatest vulnerability. I've survived 20 years on this mountain, Aaron replied, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had faced down wolves and winter storms and lived to tell about it. Figure I can handle whatever troubles come my way. But Amy noticed the way his free hand moved to check the knife at his belt, the subtle shift in his stance that suggested he was calculating distances and angles, preparing for the possibility that this conversation might end in bloodshed. The morning that had begun with confession and acceptance was rapidly transforming into something that might end with death and destruction. Lopez seemed to recognize that they had pushed as far as diplomacy would allow. He folded the legal document and tucked it back into his coat, his movements deliberate and final. You've got 1 week to reconsider, Alan. After that, the railroad moves forward with or without your cooperation. And if you're thinking about running to the territorial marshal for help, you should know that he's already signed off on the eminent domain proceedings. This is happening whether you like it or not. The two men mounted their horses with the casual efficiency of men accustomed to delivering ultimatums and making threats. As they prepared to ride away, Evans turned back with one final observation that chilled Amy to the bone. Shame about that pretty little widow, though. Hate to see her get caught up in something that's none of her concern. Maybe she'd be safer if she headed back to Denver before things get complicated up here. Aaron stepped forward, his rifle now held in both hands across his chest. Not quite aimed, but unmistakably ready. She stays. And if either of you come back onto my land without invitation, I'll consider it trespassing and act accordingly. The threat was clear and unambiguous, backed by the kind of quiet certainty that came from years of making life and death decisions in unforgiving country. Lopez and Evans might have legal documents and railroad money behind them, but Aaron had the advantage of knowing every trail and hiding place within 50 miles, along with the skills to use that knowledge effectively. After the sound of hoofbeats faded down the mountain trail, Amy and Aaron stood in silence on the porch, both absorbing the magnitude of what had just occurred. The peaceful morning routine of coffee and conversation seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the stark reality of impending conflict. "How long do we really have?" Amy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Aaron leaned the rifle against the porch railing and turned to face her, his dark eyes serious but not defeated. "Less than a week, most likely. They'll want to move fast now, before word gets out and other homesteaders start organizing resistance. Railroad companies prefer to handle these situations quietly, one property at a time." Amy felt a surge of panic at the thought of losing everything they had built together. But underneath the fear was something else, something harder and more determined. She thought of the months she had spent learning to live in this harsh but beautiful country, the satisfaction she had found in simple tasks made meaningful by necessity and shared purpose. This place had given her something she had never had before. Not just a home, but a sense of belonging, of being needed and valued for who she was rather than what she could provide. "What can we do?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Aaron studied her face with the same careful attention he gave to reading weather signs or tracking game. "We fight," he said simply, "but it won't be easy and it won't be safe. These men have resources and connections we don't have. They can make life very difficult for anyone who opposes them." Amy thought of Carol Rogers and the suffocating propriety of Denver society, of the endless charity and condescension that had marked her life as a dependent widow. She thought of the doctors who had pronounced her barren with clinical detachment, of the pitying looks and whispered conversations that had followed her everywhere. Then she looked at Aaron, this quiet man who had offered her not just shelter but partnership, who had responded to her deepest shame with practical acceptance and unwavering support. "Then we fight," she said, the words coming from some deep place she had not known existed. "This is our home, our life. If they want it, they'll have to take it." Aaron's expression shifted, revealing something that might have been surprise or approval or both. "It's going to mean giving up any chance of a normal life. Once we make this stand, there's no going back to town, no pretending to be respectable folks who follow the rules. We'll be outlaws in the eyes of the law, even if we're in the right." Amy considered this, weighing the implications against the alternatives. Return to Denver meant returning to dependence and charity, to the endless search for some man willing to marry a barren woman out of pity or convenience. It meant giving up the strength she had discovered in herself, the competence she had developed in managing the challenges of mountain life. It meant abandoning the first place that had ever felt like home. "I'd rather be an outlaw with you than a charity case anywhere else," she said, meaning every word. Aaron nodded slowly as if her response confirmed something he had hoped but not dared to assume. "Then we need to prepare. They'll be back sooner than a week, probably with more men and less patience for conversation. We need to be ready for whatever they bring." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity as Aaron began implementing plans he had clearly been considering since the railroad men's first visit. He moved with the methodical efficiency of someone who had survived by thinking ahead, by preparing for contingencies that might never come but could prove fatal if ignored. First, he showed Amy the hidden cache of supplies he had buried near the tree line, enough food and ammunition to last through a siege or a hostile retreat into the deep wilderness. Then he walked her through the network of game trails and hidden paths that crisscrossed the mountain, routes that could provide escape or tactical advantage depending on the circumstances. "If things go bad," he explained as they stood at the edge of a steep ravine that offered concealment and multiple exit routes, "you head for the old mining camp about 10 miles north. There's still good shelter there and a spring that runs year-round. George Harris knows about it, and he'll help if he can do it without endangering himself." Amy listened carefully, committing every detail to memory, while part of her mind marveled at the transformation taking place within her. 3 months ago, she had been a helpless widow, dependent on the grudging charity of relatives. Now she was preparing to defend her home against armed men, learning to think in terms of tactical advantages and emergency supplies. The change was both terrifying and exhilarating. As the day wore on, Aaron continued his preparations with grim determination. He cleaned and loaded every weapon in the cabin, checked the security of doors and windows, and moved their most valuable possessions to hiding places that would survive fire or vandalism. Amy found herself swept along in the activity, her earlier fears transformed into focused energy. But it was not until evening, as they sat by the fire planning their defense, that Aaron finally addressed the deeper implications of their situation. The railroad men had made it clear that Amy herself was considered a vulnerability, a weakness that could be exploited to force Aaron's compliance. "They're right about one thing," Aaron said, staring into the flames. "This isn't going to be safe for you. These men don't have any scruples about hurting women if it serves their purpose. Maybe you should consider going back to town, at least until this is settled." Amy felt a flash of anger at the suggestion, followed immediately by understanding. Aaron was not trying to get rid of her, but to protect her from consequences that might be worse than anything she could imagine. But she had already made her choice, and she was not going to be driven away by threats or fear. "I'm staying," she said firmly. "We're in this together, remember? For better or worse, like you said when you proposed." Aaron looked at her then with something approaching wonder, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "You know what you're choosing? This isn't going to be some romantic adventure. People might die, we might die. And even if we win, we'll be marked men, fugitives from the law." Amy met his gaze steadily, drawing strength from the certainty she saw in his eyes. "I know what I'm choosing. I'm choosing you. I'm choosing this life we've built together. I'm choosing to fight for something that matters instead of running away like I've been doing my whole life." The words hung between them like a vow, more binding than any marriage ceremony or legal document. In that moment, Amy understood that she had crossed some invisible line, leaving behind the frightened widow who had arrived at Pine Ridge Station and becoming someone new, someone capable of standing her ground against whatever forces threatened the life she had chosen. Aaron reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a grip that spoke of partnership and shared resolve. "Then we make our stand here," he said quietly. "Together." The fire crackled and settled, sending sparks up the chimney toward the star-filled sky. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant voices, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks. Amy felt a strange peace settle over her, the calm that comes from finally knowing who you are and what you stand for. But even as she savored this moment of clarity and connection, she could not shake the feeling that their greatest trials still lay ahead. The railroad men would return, probably with reinforcements and a determination to end this standoff quickly and decisively. The battle for their home and their future was about to begin in earnest, and Amy knew that everything they had built together would be tested in ways they could not yet imagine. As if reading her thoughts, Aaron squeezed her hand gently. "Whatever happens," he said, his voice carrying the quiet strength that had first drawn her to him, "we face it together. That's what marriage means. Real marriage. Standing by each other when the world tries to tear you apart." Amy nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones like warmth from the fire. She thought of her earlier confession about her inability to bear children, and Aaron's matter-of-fact response that he would borrow some from town. At the time, she had not understood what he meant, but now she began to see the deeper implications of his words. A family was not just about blood relations or biological children. It was about choosing to care for each other, to protect and support and stand together against whatever challenges arose. In that sense, they were already a family, bound by something stronger than law or convention or social expectation. The sound of distant thunder rolled across the valley, though the sky remained clear and star-filled. Aaron lifted his head, listening with the heightened awareness of someone who had learned to read the mountain's moods and warnings. After a moment, he relaxed slightly, but Amy noticed that his hand remained near the rifle propped against his chair. "Storm coming," he said quietly. "Maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after. Weather's going to turn cold and wet, which might work in our favor if trouble comes calling." Amy understood the tactical implications. Rain and cold would make any assault on the cabin more difficult and miserable, while giving defenders familiar with the terrain significant advantages. But it would also make escape or retreat more treacherous, cutting off some of the options Aaron had shown her earlier. "Are you afraid?" she asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. Aaron considered this carefully, as he did most things. "Afraid of dying? No, not particularly. Been close enough to it often enough that it doesn't hold much terror. Afraid of failing you? Of not being able to protect what we've built here? That scares me more than I care to admit." His honesty touched something deep in Amy's chest, a recognition of the vulnerability that lay beneath his stoic exterior. This man who seemed so self-sufficient and capable was also human, subject to the same fears and doubts that plagued everyone who dared to care about something worth losing. "You won't fail," she said with a conviction that surprised them both. "We won't let them take this from us." Aaron smiled then, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since the railroad men's visit. It transformed his weathered face, revealing the younger man he had been before years of isolation and hardship had carved lines of caution around his eyes. "You've changed," he observed, studying her in the firelight. "When you first came here, you were like a bird with a broken wing, afraid to trust that you were safe. Now look at you, ready to fight off railroad men and their hired guns." Amy considered this, recognizing the truth in his observation. The frightened widow who had stepped off the train at Pine Ridge Station seemed like a different person now, someone she had once been but could never be again. The transformation had been gradual but profound, built from small acts of competence and growing confidence in her ability to handle whatever challenges arose. "This place changed me," she said softly. "You changed me. For the first time in my life, I feel like I belong somewhere, like I have something worth fighting for." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of horses moving through the darkness reached them from somewhere down the mountain trail. Aaron was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, motioning for Amy to move away from the firelight. The peaceful evening was over, and the real test of their resolve was about to begin. The horses moved through the darkness with deliberate stealth, their hoofbeats muffled by the carpet of fallen leaves that covered the mountain trail. Aaron pressed himself against the cabin wall, rifle ready, while Amy crouched behind the woodpile where shadows offered concealment. The peaceful evening had shattered like glass against stone, replaced by the electric tension of impending violence. Three riders emerged from the tree line, their silhouettes barely visible against the star-filled sky. Aaron recognized the bulk of Brian Evans and the lean frame of Eric Lopez. But the third man was unfamiliar, shorter and stockier, with the careful movements of someone accustomed to dangerous work. They dismounted 50 yards from the cabin, well beyond effective rifle range, and began moving forward on foot with the coordinated precision of men who had done this before. Amy felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the figures advance through the darkness. Everything Aaron had taught her about defensive positions and escape routes suddenly seemed inadequate against the reality of armed men approaching with lethal intent. But alongside the fur was something else, a cold determination that surprised her with its intensity. These men had come to take everything she had fought to build, and she would not surrender it without a fight. "Aaron Allen," Lopez called out when they reached the edge of the clearing, his voice carrying the false courtesy of a man delivering an ultimatum. "We need to talk. Railroads decided to accelerate the timeline. New orders came in today, and they're not inclined to wait for your reconsideration." Aaron remained silent, using the darkness to his advantage while assessing the tactical situation. Three men, all armed, positioned to cover multiple angles of approach to the cabin. They had clearly learned from their earlier visit, bringing enough firepower to overwhelm resistance and positioning themselves to prevent escape. But they had also made assumptions about his capabilities that might prove costly. "Thing is," Evans added, his voice carrying a harder edge than his partner's, "railroads getting impatient with this whole situation. They've got investors asking questions, construction schedules to maintain. Time for reasonable negotiations has passed." The third man stepped forward, and Amy could see the glint of metal in his hands. Not just a pistol, but something larger, more dangerous. Aaron must have seen it too, because she heard the soft click of his rifle's safety being released. "Last chance, Allen," the stranger called out, his voice carrying the flat accent of the eastern cities. "Come out peaceful-like, and we'll make this easy on everyone. Keep playing the stubborn mountain man, and things get complicated real fast." Amy understood the subtext of the threat. These men had not come to negotiate or even to forcibly evict them. They had come to eliminate the problem permanently, to ensure that Aaron Allen would never again stand in the way of railroad expansion. The isolation that had once been their sanctuary was now their death trap. Aaron's response came not in words but in action. The rifle shot split the night air like thunder, and the third man spun sideways with a cry of pain and surprise. Aaron had aimed for the shoulder, disabling rather than killing, but the message was unmistakably clear. The mountain man was not going quietly into whatever fate the railroad had planned for him. The return fire was immediate and overwhelming. Pistol shots cracked through the darkness, while rifle bullets splintered wood and shattered windows. Amy pressed herself deeper into the woodpile's protection as splinters rained down around her, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling her nostrils. The peaceful cabin that had been her sanctuary was being systematically destroyed by men who saw it as nothing more than an obstacle to profit. "Amy, the back trail!" Aaron shouted over the gunfire, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who understood that their defensive position was rapidly becoming untenable. "Move now while they're focused on me." But Amy found herself frozen by more than fear. The thought of abandoning Aaron to face three armed men alone was unbearable, a betrayal of everything they had promised each other. She had chosen to stand with him, to fight for the life they had built together, and she would not be driven away by gunfire and threats. Instead, she did something that surprised even herself. Rising from her hiding place, she grabbed the shotgun Aaron had shown her how to load earlier that day. The weapon felt heavy and unfamiliar in her hands, but the mechanics were simple enough. Point, aim, pull the trigger. The buckshot spread would compensate for any lack of precision. The blast from the shotgun sent Evans diving for cover behind a fallen log, his curse echoing across the clearing. Amy felt the weapon's recoil slam against her shoulder, but the satisfaction of seeing one of their attackers scrambling for safety made the pain worthwhile. She was no longer just a helpless woman waiting to be rescued. She was a fighter, defending her home with everything she had. Aaron's grin was visible, even in the darkness, as he saw Amy take her stand beside him. "That's my girl," he said, working the bolt of his rifle to chamber another round. "Keep them honest while I circle around." The next few minutes passed in a blur of movement and gunfire. Aaron used his intimate knowledge of the terrain to outflank their attackers, forcing them to divide their attention between multiple threats. Amy reloaded the shotgun with hands that shook only slightly, her fear transforming into focused determination. Each shot she fired was a declaration of independence, a refusal to be driven from the life she had chosen. But the odds were still against them, and their ammunition was not unlimited. Lopez and Evans were experienced fighters, and even with their wounded companion, they maintained disciplined fire that kept Aaron and Amy pinned down. The cabin's walls were being steadily chewed apart by rifle bullets, and it was only a matter of time before a lucky shot found its mark. That was when the unexpected sound of additional horses reached them from down the mountain trail. Aaron and Amy exchanged glances, both wondering if the railroad had sent reinforcements. But the voice that called out through the darkness carried the familiar cadence of George Harris from the general store. "Aaron, you all right up there? Heard shooting and figured you might need some help." The relief Amy felt at hearing a friendly voice was almost overwhelming, but it was tempered by the realization that George had brought others with him. As the new arrivals spread out through the trees, she could make out at least 4 additional figures, all carrying weapons and moving with the careful coordination of men who had fought together before. "About time you showed up, George," Aaron called back, his voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and grim humor. "Was starting to think I'd have to handle this all by myself." The arrival of reinforcements changed the tactical situation dramatically. Lopez and Evans found themselves surrounded, outnumbered by men who knew the terrain as well as Aaron did. The wounded third man was already calling for surrender. His earlier bravado evaporated in the face of superior firepower and desperate circumstances. "This isn't over, Allen," Lopez shouted as he raised his hands in surrender. "Railroads got resources you can't imagine. They'll send more men, better men. You can't fight them forever." Aaron emerged from his position behind a large pine tree, rifle trained on the captured men. "Maybe not forever," he agreed, his voice carrying the quiet certainty that Amy had come to associate with his most serious moments. "But I can fight them long enough." George Harris stepped into the firelight, and Amy could see that he was not alone. With him were Larry Gray, the blacksmith from Pine Ridge Station, along with Nancy Wright and Ashley Miller, 2 women whose husbands had died in mining accidents the previous winter. Behind them came Judith Mitchell, the school teacher who had lost her position when the town council decided that educating children was less important than keeping taxes low. Amy realized with growing amazement that these were not random neighbors who had heard gunfire and come to investigate. These were people who had their own grievances against the railroad companies, their own reasons for standing with Aaron against the forces of so-called progress. George had not just brought help, he had brought allies. Figured you might need some backup, George explained, his weathered face serious in the flickering light. Word got around town about what these railroad men were planning. Folks started remembering other times when big companies came in promising prosperity and left nothing but broken promises and empty pockets. Larry Gray nodded grimly. Railroad promised jobs for local men when they built the spur line through Kemper Creek. Instead, they brought in Chinese workers at half wages and left our people with nothing. Same story every time these companies move into new territory. Amy listened to the conversation swirling around her and began to understand something that had not been clear before. Aaron's stand against the railroad was not just about one man's attachment to his land. It was part of a larger pattern of resistance against forces that treated people and communities as expendable resources to be consumed and discarded in the pursuit of profit. Nancy Wright approached Amy with the careful courtesy of one woman acknowledging another's courage. Heard you stood your ground tonight, fought alongside your man like a true partner. That takes backbone, especially for someone who wasn't raised to this kind of life. Amy felt a flush of pride at the recognition. These were women who had faced their own hardships and losses, who understood what it meant to fight for survival in an unforgiving world. Their acceptance meant more than any formal ceremony or legal document could have provided. What happens now? Amy asked, looking around at the group of determined faces illuminated by the cabin's damaged windows. Aaron and George exchanged a look that spoke of conversations held in private, plans made in anticipation of this moment. Now we make it clear that this valley is under protection, Aaron said. Not just my protection, but the protection of everyone who believes that ordinary people have the right to defend what's theirs. The wounded railroad man, his shoulder bound with strips torn from his own shirt, looked around at the assembled group with growing alarm. You people don't understand what you're getting into. This isn't just about one homestead anymore. You're talking about organized resistance to legitimate business interest. That's conspiracy, maybe even sedition. Ashley Miller laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Sedition? Is that what they're calling it when folks refuse to be robbed blind? My husband died in a mine collapse because the company cut corners on safety to increase profits. My children went hungry while the mine owners built mansions in Denver. If standing against that is sedition, then I guess I'm a seditious woman. Amy felt something shift inside her as she listened to these stories of loss and resistance. Her own struggles with barrenness and widowhood seemed smaller in the context of these larger injustices, but also more meaningful. Every person here had faced circumstances that could have broken them, had chosen to fight rather than surrender to forces beyond their control. The railroad will send more men, Eric Lopez said, his voice carrying the desperate authority of someone whose world was collapsing around him. Federal marshals, territorial militia if necessary. You can't win against that kind of power. George Harris spat into the dirt with obvious contempt. Maybe we can't win in the long run, but we can make it cost them more than they're willing to pay. Railroad companies understand profit and loss better than they understand right and wrong. Make their operations expensive enough, and they'll find easier routes through other people's land. Aaron nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. George is right. This isn't about winning a war. It's about making ourselves too expensive to be worth the trouble. Railroads got shareholders and investors to answer to. If they can't show a profit on this route, they'll abandon it for something more promising. Amy began to see the larger strategy taking shape. They were not planning to fight a pitched battle against overwhelming odds, but to wage a campaign of resistance that would make the railroad's operations untenable. It was a David and Goliath story, but with economics rather than divine intervention providing the slingshot. What about the law, she asked, thinking of the territorial marshal Lopez had mentioned earlier. If they bring federal authority into this, won't that change everything? Larry Gray's expression darkened. Law's already been bought and paid for. Territorial government gets most of its revenue from mining and railroad taxes. They're not going to side with homesteaders against the companies that keep them in office. But Judith Mitchell stepped forward with a different perspective. Law's more complicated than that. Federal government's got competing interests too. They want the railroads built, but they also promised homestead rights to settlers who were willing to develop the territories. Push too hard against homesteaders, and you risk a political backlash that could reach all the way to Washington. Amy found herself thinking about the broader implications of their situation. What had started as a personal fight for survival had become part of a larger struggle over the future of the American West. Would it be developed by large corporations that extracted wealth and left communities impoverished, or by ordinary people who built lasting homes and businesses rooted in local prosperity? The sound of approaching dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, revealing the full extent of the damage to Aaron's cabin. Bullet holes pocked the walls, windows were shattered, and the front porch bore scars from the night's violence. But the structure remained sound, and more importantly, it remained in the hands of those who had chosen to defend it. "We need to get these men to town," Aaron said, gesturing toward the captured railroad agents. "Let folks see what kind of methods the railroad's willing to use to get what it wants." Amy watched as their prisoners were loaded onto horses for the journey down the mountain. Lopez and Evans maintained their sullen defiance, but the wounded third man seemed genuinely shaken by the night's events. Perhaps he had expected to face a lone homesteader and his frightened wife, not a coordinated group of determined defenders. As the group prepared to leave for Pine Ridge Station, Nancy Wright approached Amy with an unexpected offer. "You're welcome to come stay with me and the children while Aaron's dealing with the aftermath of all this. Might be safer than staying up here alone." Amy considered the offer carefully. The practical part of her mind recognized the wisdom of accepting temporary refuge while the immediate danger passed. But another part of her, the part that had emerged during the night's fighting, rejected the idea of retreat. "Thank you," she said finally, "but I think I need to stay here. This is my home now, and I won't be driven from it by threats or fear." Aaron overheard the exchange and moved to stand beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You're sure? It's going to be dangerous for a while yet. These men were just the first wave. Railroad's not going to give up after one setback." Amy looked around at the damaged cabin, at the bullet-scarred trees, at the evidence of violence that had shattered their peaceful mountain refuge. Then she looked at Aaron's face, seeing in his dark eyes the same mixture of determination and uncertainty that she felt in her own heart. "I'm sure," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "We started something here tonight, something bigger than just defending one homestead. I want to see it through to the end." George Harris nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit we're going to need if we're going to make this work. Railroad's counting on folks getting scared and giving up after the first show of force. When they realize we're not backing down, they'll have to recalculate their entire approach." As the group prepared to depart with their prisoners, Amy felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The night had tested her in ways she had never imagined, had revealed reserves of courage and determination she had not known she possessed. But more than that, it had shown her what it meant to be part of something larger than herself, to stand with others who shared her values and convictions. Aaron lingered after the others had started down the trail, his expression serious as he studied Amy's face in the growing daylight. "You know there's no going back now," he said quietly. "After tonight, we're committed to this fight whether we want to be or not." Amy nodded, understanding the full implications of his words. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, had chosen a path that would define the rest of their lives, but she felt no regret about the choice, only a deep sense of rightness about the stand they had taken. "I know," she replied, "and I'm not afraid anymore. Not of the railroad, not of what people might say, not of what the future might bring. We're in this together, and that's enough." Aaron's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountain peaks, warm and full of promise despite the destruction that surrounded them. "Then I guess it's time to make this official," he said, reaching into his shirt pocket to withdraw a simple gold band that caught the morning light. "Been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the right moment to ask properly." Amy stared at the ring, understanding that this was not just a proposal but a declaration of partnership in every sense of the word. They had already proven themselves as allies in battle. Now Aaron was asking her to become his partner in whatever came next. Amy Garcia, he said formally, dropping to one knee among the scattered debris of their fight. Will you marry me? Not just for convenience or propriety, but because I love you and want to spend whatever time we have left building something worth defending. The words hung in the mountain air like a prayer offered to the dawn, simple and honest and completely without artifice. Amy felt tears she had not expected burning behind her eyes as she looked down at this man who had given her not just shelter but purpose, not just protection, but partnership. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Aaron Allen, I will marry you. For love, for partnership, for whatever comes next. He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, and Amy marveled at how perfectly it fit, as if it had been made specifically for her. Perhaps it had been crafted during one of Aaron's trips to town while she was learning to call his cabin home. They stood together in the wreckage of the night's battle, surrounded by bullet holes and broken glass, and Amy felt a happiness so complete it seemed to encompass all the pain and fear that had brought them to this moment. They had found each other across the divide of different backgrounds and experiences, had chosen to stand together against forces that would have destroyed them separately. About what you said before, Amy said, remembering Aaron's cryptic response to her confession about being unable to bear children, about borrowing some from town. What did you mean? Aaron's expression grew thoughtful as he considered how to explain something that had seemed obvious to him but might be harder for others to understand. Look around, he said, gesturing toward the trail where their allies had disappeared with the railroad prisoners. Nancy Wright's got 3 children who need a father figure. Ashley Miller's boy is growing up wild without proper guidance. Judith Mitchell's been trying to teach school without a proper schoolhouse or community support. Amy began to understand what he was suggesting, and the implications took her breath away. You want to bring them here? Create some kind of community? Not just here, Aaron replied, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who had been thinking about this for a long time. All through these mountains, there are people who've been pushed out of towns and mining camps, folks who want to build something lasting but don't have the resources to do it alone. What if we help them? What if we created the kind of place where families could thrive without having to bow down to railroad companies or mining corporations? Amy felt her heart racing as the vision took shape in her mind. Not just a homestead, but a community. Not just survival, but prosperity built on cooperation rather than exploitation. It was ambitious beyond anything she had ever imagined. But after the night they had just survived, nothing seemed impossible. It would be dangerous, she said, thinking through the practical implications. The railroad won't be the only threat. There will be others who see what we're building and want to take it for themselves. Aaron nodded soberly. Every worthwhile thing involves risk. But we've already proven we can stand together when it matters, and we won't be alone. Tonight showed that there are more people ready to fight for something better than I realized. Amy thought about the children Nancy Wright and Ashley Miller were raising alone, about Judith Mitchell's determination to provide education despite official indifference, about Larry Gray's skills as a blacksmith that could benefit an entire community. Each person who had stood with them tonight brought something valuable, some skill or knowledge or resource that could contribute to the larger vision Aaron was describing. What about the railroad, she asked. They're not going to give up just because we won one fight. No, Aaron agreed, but they're also not going to commit unlimited resources to a route that keeps costing them money and generating bad publicity. If we can make this valley too expensive to take, they'll find easier targets elsewhere. Amy considered this, recognizing the cold logic behind the strategy. Railroad companies were businesses first and foremost, driven by profit margins and investor expectations. Make their operations sufficiently costly and complicated, and they would eventually seek more profitable opportunities elsewhere. And if they don't give up, if they keep sending men and guns until they get what they want, Aaron's expression grew hard, revealing the steel beneath his quiet exterior. Then we keep fighting, not just us, but everyone who believes that ordinary people deserve the chance to build something lasting. This isn't just about one valley or one homestead anymore. It's about what kind of country we're going to leave for the next generation. Amy felt the truth of his words settle into her bones like warmth from a winter fire. They were not just defending their personal happiness, but participating in a larger struggle over the soul of the American West. Would it be developed by corporations that extracted wealth and left communities impoverished? Or by people who built lasting homes and businesses rooted in local prosperity? The sound of horses returning up the trail interrupted her thoughts, and Amy saw George Harris riding back toward the cabin with an expression of grim satisfaction on his weathered face. Behind him came Nancy Wright and Ashley Miller, along with several other figures Amy did not immediately recognize. "Delivered your railroad men to the territorial marshal," George called out as he approached. "Caused quite a stir in town when folks saw what condition they were in. Word's already spreading about what happened up here." Amy felt a mixture of pride and apprehension at the news. Their stand against the railroad would no longer be a private matter between Aaron and his attackers. It would become part of the larger conversation about development and resistance that was shaping the future of the territories. Nancy Wright dismounted and approached Amy with the careful respect of one woman acknowledging another's courage. "Heard you're planning to make this official," she said, gesturing toward the ring on Amy's finger. "About time, if you ask me. You two have been acting like married folks for months anyway." Amy laughed, feeling a lightness she had not experienced since childhood. "I suppose we have, but it feels different now, making it official. More real somehow." "That's because you've been tested," Ashley Miller observed, her own expression serious despite the celebratory mood. "Easy to make promises when times are good. Takes something special to stand by them when bullets are flying." Aaron joined the group of women, his arms settling naturally around Amy's waist in a gesture that spoke of partnership rather than mere possession. "Amy's got more backbone than she gives herself credit for," he said quietly. "Took me a while to see it, but she's been fighting battles her whole life. Just took the right circumstances to bring out the warrior in her." Amy felt a flush of pride at his words, recognizing the truth in them. Her struggles with barrenness and widowhood, her determination to survive in an unforgiving world, her refusal to be broken by circumstances beyond her control. All of these had been preparing her for this moment when she would need to stand and fight for something that mattered. "So what happens now?" she asked, looking around at the group of determined faces that had become her chosen family. "How do we turn last night's victory into something lasting?" George Harris pulled out a hand-drawn map, spreading it on the cabin's damaged porch for everyone to see. "Been thinking about that. There are maybe a dozen families scattered through these mountains, all trying to make a go of it on their own. Most of them would be interested in joining something bigger if they thought it had a chance of succeeding." Amy studied the map, seeing the isolated homesteads and abandoned mining claims that dotted the region. Each mark represented people who had chosen the hard path of independence over the easier road of submission to corporate authority. Together, they might represent something powerful enough to change the balance of power in the territory. "It won't be easy," Aaron warned, his practical nature asserting itself even in the face of growing excitement. "Building a community from scratch, especially one that's going to be under constant threat from outside forces. We'll need to be completely self-sufficient, able to defend ourselves and provide for all our basic needs without depending on the outside world." Amy nodded, understanding the magnitude of what they were contemplating. But she also remembered the satisfaction she had found in simple tasks like cooking and cleaning when they served a larger purpose. The sense of competence she had developed in managing the challenges of mountain life. If she could learn to defend her home with a shotgun, she could certainly learn whatever other skills community building might require. "When do we start?" she asked, surprising everyone, including herself, with the directness of the question. Aaron's grin was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Right now," he said. "We start right now with a wedding that brings this community together and shows everyone that we're serious about building something that will last." As the group began making plans for a ceremony that would be both celebration and declaration of independence, Amy felt a deep sense of completion settling over her, and the frightened widow who had stepped off the train at Pine Ridge Station was gone forever, replaced by someone stronger and more capable than she had ever imagined possible. She thought of her earlier confession about being unable to bear children, and Aaron's response that he would borrow some from town. Now she understood what he had meant and the wisdom of his words. Family was not just about blood relations or biological inheritance. It was about choosing to care for each other, to stand together against whatever challenges arose, to build something worth passing on to the next generation. Looking around at the faces of the people who had chosen to stand with them, Amy saw the future taking shape. Nancy Wright's children would have a safe place to grow up, with strong role models and a community that valued education and hard work. Ashley Miller's boy would learn skills and values that would serve him well in whatever life he chose to build. Judith Mitchell would have her school, and Larry Gray would have customers for his blacksmith services. And George Harris would have a community of people who understood that true prosperity came from cooperation rather than exploitation. The sun climbed higher over the mountain peaks, burning away the last shadows of the night's violence and illuminating the beginning of something new. Amy Garcia, soon to be Amy Allen, stood with her chosen family among the ruins of one battle and the foundations of something larger, something worth fighting for, something that would endure long after the railroad companies had moved on to easier targets. In the distance, a hawk circled on the mountain thermals, its cry echoing across the valley like a promise of freedom. Amy smiled, understanding at last that she had found not just a home but a purpose, not just love, but a cause worth defending. The confession that had begun this journey, her admission of barrenness and shame, had led her to discover a different kind of fertility, the ability to nurture and protect a community of chosen family that would grow and thrive in the years to come. The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and possibility, and Amy Allen breathed it in like a prayer answered, like a promise kept, like the first day of the rest of her life.